Hello, everyone, and welcome on into the Unabated podcast. I'm Thomas Viola, and joining me, as always, it's Captain Jack Andrews. And Jack, we are all recovered from Bet Bash here. Our voices have returned to us just in time. You're going to miss it if you're listening to this, but I'm excited. I'm going to be seeing you at our Atlantic City meetup tonight. And if people want to be staying tuned for more meetups, they can do that in our Discord. But we've also got a great show coming up today, Jack. The U.S. Open is upon us for tennis. And so we're bringing back Isaac Rose-Berman. Look, you want to talk about one of the young rising stars in this business right now. It was great meeting Isaac at Bet Bash, and that is one smart kid there, Jack.
Yeah, no, Isaac's definitely a great kid. I'm a big fan of Isaac and what he's been doing lately. And yeah, Tom, look, we're back from Bet Bash. We have just this brief sprint of getting ready for football. By the
Mm-hmm.
time some people listening to this, the first games are going to have already happened in college football, week zero. My kind of feeling on week zero is these are like I kind of wish it didn't exist. I feel like it's just rushing the season, and the whole week zero, week one throws people off. Really, the main event is next week when week one kicks off and we get the full slate of college football. What do you think, though? I mean, does week zero feel like it's like the college football preseason?
Yeah, I describe it exactly as that because I'm not the biggest college football guy in the world. I prefer watching the NFL, but it's a fun week. It's a good start. But when it comes to the betting on it, I was asking you about this because I'm sitting there looking at the unabated screen and I'm saying, how are the edges? Like, should I be pounding week zero lines? What should I be doing? And you were telling me, stay away.
Yeah, it's all sports tend towards efficiency. All markets tend towards efficiency, and that includes as the season begins through when the season ends. So, especially with college football, where we don't have a preseason, we have some inter squad scrimmages and things like that that actually draw massive crowds, but we don't have a preseason. We don't know what we don't know yet. So, college football and college basketball, for that matter, are two sports where I tend to uh, wade into the water tepidly.
I think that is a good way to look at it, and I'm going to be doing the same thing. But I'm excited. It's been nice being here in New Jersey for a couple days and being able to bet with the litany of sports books that we have out here. But I'm going to stay disciplined, stick to some of my props that I'm riding out through the end of the summer seasons here, and then in a couple weeks we have a great for the start of fall sports coming up. But right now, let's talk some tennis with Isaac Rose-Berman. Let's bring him on.
How's it going, guys? Good to be here.
Hey, Isaac, thank you so much for joining us once again. We are very excited. I think this is the fastest returning guest that we've ever had, Jack.
It absolutely is, but it's well deserved.
Honored, honored.
So you're getting ready now for the U.S. Open. We had you on last time. We were talking Wimbledon, right?
Yeah.
Well, it is great to have you back, and we're excited to get started with some U.S. Open discussions here. But to start it off, walk us through what have you been doing now? We're a week away from the tournament. How are you preparing?
Yeah, so I think one of the big things, obviously this depends on, how serious you're taking it, but one of the big things is making sure you sort of understand all of the different outs available to you and making sure that you have the ability to bet in all of them. So especially in tennis, there's, so much more volume during these big tournaments that you're often able to expend a large percentage of your bankroll. Maybe in the first few days of a tournament, you have 20, 30, 40 bets in a way that you maybe don't for other times of the year. And so the ability to say, okay, I have 7 different sports books available to me. I either have money in all of those sports books or have an easy way to get money into all of those sports books. You don't want to end up with a situation where you have a bunch of bets on a certain sports book and then you can't end up betting there. So that's the main thing. And then also for me, if you're doing this really full time, also kind of prepping your schedule. Majors are almost like the March Madness for tennis. So there's just so much action, especially if you're doing both pre-match and live. And so, to cancel some dinner plans, cancel seeing some friends, it sort of sounds ridiculous. But if you're going to take it really seriously, and especially if you're going to be betting, 8, 10 hours a day with live, then you don't want too many distractions, especially during that first week. So a lot of prep, and then the draw comes out in a few days. And so there's going to be, obviously some additional prep after the draw comes out, before the odds come out. I think a really important thing that not that many people do is after you see the draw to sort of make your own numbers for all of those first round matches, both to see whether you might have any edges and also see where you maybe deviate from the market. And if you're using a model, obviously that's pretty easy. But even for more recreational bettors who maybe aren't using a model, just to have an idea so you're not really tainted by the numbers that come out. You can say, okay, I make this line plus 200, it comes out and it's maybe plus 300, and you can say, okay, here's where I deviate from the market. You can see where that opens versus where it closes, because oftentimes if you disagree with the market, that's going to persist for at least a few matches into the tournament. And so it's really good to know that up front.
So what's the importance of the draw, though, in terms of how it affects the tournament? I'm speaking this as a tennis layperson.
No, so it matters for a couple reasons. So first of all, obviously, you don't know what the first round matchups are going to be, right? So anybody can play anybody. For futures in particular, though, it can matter both if you're sort of a long shot player and maybe, if someone is, let's say, 100 to 1 to win the tournament, but they end up getting Alcaraz or Djokovic drawn in the first round, it's probably not good to bet on them. So I would definitely hold off on really betting futures until the draw comes out. And then also, when we have a pretty top heavy section, whether it's both in men's or women's, right now there are really three players at the top of the men's game: Djokovic, Alcaraz, and Sinner. And so two of those guys are going to be in the same half of the draw. So from a futures standpoint, you're probably going to want to bet on underdogs who are on the side of the draw with only one of those guys. So they only will have to beat one of them as opposed to two.
And I know the draw is based on their world ranking, I assume, but is there also some randomness to it? Is there committee behind it?
So I believe for the U.S. Open, I should know this. I know for Wimbledon, there's a little bit of committee. For the U.S. Open, I believe it's just the rankings, and just so it just goes off of those. And so, if you're one, you're not going to face the two until the final. And there's 32 seeds, 128 players in the draw. But so if you're outside of that top 32, then you kind of could get placed anywhere. The
Okay.
33rd player in the world doesn't have any benefit over the 100th player in the world.
Okay, cool. That's one thing that I've never factored into figuring out for tennis. So thank you, Isaac, for explaining that to me. I'm learning something new. All right, so you approach a tennis tournament. How do you divide up your time in terms of futures bets, pregame bets, and then things you might want to attack in game?
Yeah, so for me, futures are definitely the smallest part. When the draw comes out, and then if there are any players, mainly I kind of focus on them. Obviously, you're looking for value, but sometimes from a more recreational perspective, especially if there's a couple guys who are really big long shots, can make it a little fun to be able to root for them throughout the tournament. If you're betting at someone, maybe 150 to 1 odds. So futures are a very small percentage, and then I would say relatively evenly split between pre-match and live betting, but that just really depends on what's available. So there are 4 Grand Slams a year, and books are always offering different sort of prop markets. Sometimes the prices are good, sometimes they're not good, sometimes they're new markets. And so tournament to tournament, it really just depends. And that's why I think the first 2 days after the draw comes out, but before the tournament has started, are really important to familiarize yourself with all of the prop offerings and the sort of more derivative markets that are available. So you can say, okay, we're probably gonna have a lot of action on the line here.
Now, I know when it comes to golf, Rufus is obviously each week he's betting all of these tournaments, but then there's significantly more volume in the majors because it's like the Super Bowl. There's more for you to bet on, and there's more for him to find. Are you finding it's the same way? Are you only focusing on majors? How do you break up the tennis schedule when it comes to the effort you're putting in each week on these tournaments?
It's definitely an apt comparison. The volume is just a lot higher, so the tournament is bigger. It's a round of 128 versus a round of 32 for most tournaments. Some tournaments are a round of 64, so there's just a lot more matches. So the liquidity is a lot higher. There's a lot more props. For me personally, I focus on the men's, and so the difference there is that you're playing best 3 out of 5 sets versus best 2 out of 3 sets, and so not only does that mean that there's sort of both more significance for the matches if you're betting on the money line, but there's a variety of different derivative markets that are a function there as well. If you think of if you're playing a best 2 out of 3 set match, you can only bet on whether the match is going to be 2 sets or 3 sets. Whereas if it's 3 out of 5 sets, you can bet on the match being 3 sets or 4 sets or 5 sets. And so just kind of combinatorically on the men's side, there's a few more options, which makes it much more appealing for me as someone who really enjoys those more derivative markets. But yeah, I would say for me personally, I probably get more than half of my volume throughout the year during these 4 Grand Slam tournaments, of which the US is one of them, the US Open.
So, do you actually watch a lot of tennis, or are you kind of mapping this out before the tournament starts, and you're just going by like a Bet365 feed, which they're blazingly fast for those in-game feeds, by the way. Uh, what's your approach?
Yeah, so I do watch a lot. I'm also a big tennis fan, so I know this varies a lot person to person. So I do watch a lot, and I think it's really important to watch if you think a lot of your edge comes from knowing the sport and maybe having some sort of qualitative things which you can then quantify later. Um, if you're doing a more top-down approach, it's probably not necessary to watch, but especially for live betting, if you think that, part of you winning comes, I know for me at least, um, I sometimes live bet without watching the match, but in my mind, I'm just giving up alpha there if I'm not being able to see what's happening. And then in particular, it's tricky to know when you should watch, both for an enjoyment perspective and when it's sort of too stressful. I remember last year in the U.S. Open, there are a lot of night matches at the U.S. Open, so matches that end up going really late. And I remember there was only one match left in the day. I had a bet on it. I wasn't going to live bet it anymore, and I just end up staying up really late to watch this one match just to sort of sweat out this last bet. It wasn't particularly enjoyable, and I would have been better served just going to bed early. So knowing when you should watch it, both because that'll either give you an edge or just not be super stressful, is a tricky question. I wish I had a better process to decide, because I definitely make some mistakes watching when I shouldn't and not watching when I should.
Now, Isaac, you're physically located in New York City. Have you attended the U.S. Open?
I go every year. It's my favorite sporting event. I'll be going at least 2 or 3 times. One of my favorite weeks is actually going on right now. So it's the qualifying. So basically, to get into the tournament, and there you can go. It's a little bit less chaotic. Tickets are cheaper, and you can go see a lot of these early matches. And the men and women they're fighting, because it's especially for a lot of these lower ranked players, even being able to get into the main draw is a huge deal. They just increased the prize money now, so if you lose in the first round of the U.S. Open, you get 100 grand. So it's big money, especially for a lot of these lower ranked players. They care a lot.
Yeah. All right. You don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but have you tried to courtside at the U.S. Open?
I have at times. It with varying degrees of success. I think one of the issues is that you can get geolocated at the U.S. Open, and then that can be a little bit of an issue. But yes, I have had people tell me, "Hey, maybe you should check out this court. This umpire is a little bit slower." But rarely, if I'm at the U.S. Open, usually I'm just there to try to have some fun.
So
It's
I mean,
almost like they think of these things.
well, so actually, the professional courtsiders I know are relay men. So
Yes, yes.
they text somebody a single letter, and that indicates what the bet should be, and that person bets it in so that they don't get geolocated too. Um,
My
but anyway, we don't
operation's
need to
not
get
that
into
sophisticated. Yeah.
the gray area here. But go ahead, Tom.
Now, you mentioned in an earlier answer here that you really love the derivative markets. First off, is that what you're doing most of your betting in? And second off, what kind of derivatives are there for tennis? Because I'm sure a lot of our listeners aren't as avid of tennis fans as you. So, myself included, like what do derivatives look like for tennis too?
For sure. Yeah. So it depends men and women. The two main ones are sort of the spread and the total, and you can get that both for the games and the sets. And so, as I mentioned before, if you're playing best 2 out of 3 sets from a set total perspective, it's only 2 or 3 sets. And then in the men's, since it's 3 out of 5, it's 3, 4, or 5 sets. But you also get game totals, and you get game spreads and set spreads. And for the men, with the 3 out of 5, you can get a player minus 1.5 sets, which would mean that if they win 3-0 or 3-1, you cover the spread, or minus 2.5 sets, which is generally for big favorites. So you basically need them to win 3-0. So those are the main spreads, and those are going to be available at basically every book. And then beyond that, it really depends. And that's why I said, the first couple weeks or the first couple days after the draw comes out are important to see what's available. You're going to see set scores. So, for example, whether a player wins 2-1 or on the men's 3-1, 3-2, that's pretty common. But then there's everything else. I mean, I can say that one of my favorite derivative markets historically has been one player to win the first set and then the other player to win the match. And that's sort of mostly viable during these major tournaments for men, because if you are playing best 3 out of 5, then you have a lot more time to come back, right? Whereas if in the best 2 out of 3, you're basically just betting one person to win the first set, the other person to win the next 2 sets. Whereas in 3 out of 5, you can get you have some more leeway for that person to make up that ground later. But all sorts of derivative markets, correct score, who's going to be leading after the first 4 games, all of these things, so many markets, and it just depends because they're always changing.
Now, how are you managing your bankroll when it comes to allocating across a lot of different bets? Because I'm assuming you've got a lot of tennis going on, especially in the early rounds, that that you might want to be getting down on. Do you run into problems with that?
So obviously, this is a person to person thing.
Mhm.
One sort of thing I would recommend, especially for people who are just starting out, is to probably have a lower unit size at the beginning of tournaments. Not only because you have so many matches going on, so you can mitigate the swings, but also because, especially in the first round, there's still some private information that you might not be privy to. And as a result, you might get some adverse selection in your bets. And what I mean by that is, as you mentioned before, there's a huge incentive to play these tournaments because the prize money is really big. The ranking points are very large. And so, for example, even if someone is a little bit injured, they're probably not going to drop out because they're really incentivized to at least play that first round. And so you might, unless you have some sort of incredible network to get all of this information, you might not know players' true fitness levels. Whereas after the first round, you've already seen them play once. And so your most recent data point is closer. And so there's sort of less randomness there. And so I've personally found for myself that my ROI is generally lower in round 1 than it is in later rounds, and I'm pretty sure that's because I'm seeing some edges, and that's actually a result of some private information that I'm not privy to. And so that's just one thing to keep in mind, especially at the beginning of the tournament, is to pace yourself a little bit, and if you see a really big edge, know that there might be something that you're not aware of.
Interesting. Yeah. Just real quick follow up on that. Do injuries play a role in tennis? In other words, we see in a lot of sports there will be undisclosed injuries that come out later, but there's also official injury reports that kind of lead you in some directions. What's it like in tennis?
Yeah, so you get both of those. Players will give press conferences, and so you can, listen to press conferences where a player says, "Hey, my hip is really hurting." The number 2 player in the world right now, Yannick Sinner, sort of going through some hip issues, although he just won this major tournament. So it's kind of unclear, but yeah, I mean, there will be official press releases. Players will do press conferences, but you might not have the best information, and so I would, unless you're a really sophisticated bettor with a large network, injury information is probably going to be something where you're going to be at a disadvantage for tennis. And so I think that's, for me, it's just trying to avoid those instances. Another thing that's really important is knowing the difference in house rules. And what I mean by that is some sports books will, if a player retires mid-match, they'll grade it as a loss. Sometimes they'll grade it as a void. And especially for men in majors during these longer matches, you see more retirements. And so it's really important to know the rules of the book that you're betting at. So, for example, if you're betting on someone and you think that their opponent has a high chance of retiring, it might be worth betting a plus 120 at a book where if their opponent retires after the first set, you're going to win the bet, versus a plus 125 at a book where if they retire, the whole bet is going to be a void. And so that's just something to keep in mind. Just knowing the house rules, always important, but can be particularly important for these major tournaments, particularly for men where they have these longer matches during Grand Slams.
Now, what about correlation? Like, are you looking at anything where you're significantly saying, "Oh, hey, these two things are correlated," and maybe people aren't quite picking up on that?
So it's tricky to do that across matches, but within matches there are a couple things that are pretty much always correlated. So the
Hmm.
under and the favorite are usually correlated, and that's because if the better player wins, they're likely going to blow the other person out, in which case it's going to be shorter. And so obviously the inverse as well, the over and and the underdog are quite correlated. Another thing is sort of the quality of the serve of either player and the over as well, and that's because if one or both of the players has a very good serve, they're less likely to lose their service games, and so the sets are going to be longer, and so you're going to have more sets which end in tiebreakers, which end 7-6 or 6-4 as opposed to 6-2 or 6-1. So that those are the two main things. There are some issues as well with sort of cross match correlations, like maybe all of the favorites are doing really well, or something about either the weather or the courts, but those are a lot trickier. And so I think with the in-game correlations, especially with a lot of books now offering same-game parlays, understanding how all these things are correlated is more important than ever.
In your opinion, and again, you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, are the books accurately factoring in the correlation?
For same-game parlays, or
For, yeah, well, let's start there. Or for that favorite and under angle that you were talking about.
yeah, so most sports books don't allow you to sort of blindly parlay the favorite and the under, or the dog and the over. So it doesn't really matter as much. Now a lot of books do have same game parlays. That's kind of the most basic correlation. And of course, for same game parlays, there's a huge amount of extra vig added, and so that's something really you got to keep in mind. I was just playing around this morning, and I combined an over and a game spread, which were each minus 110, and the same game parlay spit out a plus 102. And so obviously there, that's something where you have to be very cognizant of how much juice you're paying. So I think in general, they kind of know about that one, but especially, for me in 3 out of 5 set matches in particular, I will be playing a lot of same game parlays this US Open, and having a model that's able to simulate those and estimate the true odds is tricky for sure. But I think both that's where some of the larger edges are going to come from, and it's the most fun for me because it's the least knowable.
Absolutely. So, what kind of so we've talked to this before a little bit about the Wimbledon, right? We how the grass court caused a lot of more power servers to get the advantage. What about the U.S. Open? Are there certain court level advantages that certain players have?
Yeah, so the U.S. Open is not as fast as Wimbledon as a hard court versus a grass court, but it's still fairly fast. There's some reports out now that maybe it's a little bit slower than people had anticipated, and going to have to, once again, another reason to sort of wait for maybe a round or at least watch the qualifying to see how the courts are playing. I think one of the interesting things is how American players will fare at the U.S. Open versus other tournaments. This is sort of a constant question of whether or not there is a home court advantage, whether or not that's factored into the odds. Especially now, there are a huge number of men and women at the very top of the game. On the men's side in particular, I think the last time I checked, there were 4 Americans who were ranked between like 12 and 15 in the world. And so those guys are, not the top contenders for these tournaments, but definitely viable candidates to go pretty far. And some of them in particular have done a lot better at the U.S. Open, both because the court suits their game. Perhaps they're more, comfortable on American soil and American courts, and also they have that home crowd support. And U.S. Open fans can be pretty intense, as we talked about. There's some late night matches where the crowds can kind of get pretty rowdy, and so yeah, that's definitely going to be something to watch.
And that's actually something that I wanted to ask you about next was when it comes to some of the residual information that is out there, like if you know the matchup but only know the surface, like what kind of what kind of things can you take into account when it comes to things like the location of the tournament, the level, things like that?
Yeah, so it varies a lot. Even just the surface alone, if you think historically, Federer versus Nadal, one of, if not the greatest rivalry in men's tennis, that match when played on clay, Nadal is a massive, massive favorite. And if it's played on hard court or grass, Federer is probably going to be a solid favorite, depending on when you look at it throughout their careers. And so it really depends on the players. And even there's, a lot of variation. Historically, Novak Djokovic has done far better at the Australian Open than the US Open, even though those are both hard courts, which theoretically should be fairly similar. And so, yeah, I wish I could say more than that, but it really just depends on the matchup in question.
So you mentioned that the surface may be a little slower this year. Why would it be different than past years? Do they do
They
a
they
little?
con- they constantly resurface it.
Really?
Yeah, and so it's a function of also the weather. I mean, people thought it was going to be really fast this year because a lot of the other American hard court tournaments that are sort of preparation for the U.S. Open have been very fast. But I've just been seeing some reports in the last few days that it's slower. I haven't been. As I said, I love to go to the Open, especially in the qualifying. Not that I'm that good, but to be able to sort of see it firsthand when you can really watch these guys and girls when there's maybe 10 other people watching. And so you can really get a feel for how the courts are playing.
That's fascinating to me that we have sports where these constants, yet they still change all the time. Baseball is a great example, right? They keep monkeying with the ball. It's just amazing. It's almost like in basketball, if they refinished the court with a different material other than hardwood and said, okay, that's what we're playing with over here. We're playing on this, spongy trampoline or something like that. Yeah, really
Well, did
amazing
you
that
know,
that
Jack?
works.
They used to have carpet as a surface in tennis up until about
Really?
15 years ago, I believe. Yeah, it was super super fast, and then they got rid of it. But yeah, so there used to be even more variation, but now we just have hard clay and grass. But yeah, even though the majority of the tour is played on hard court, there's still a lot of variance, or a lot of differences between the different hard courts.
I love conversations like this because admittedly I am not a tennis fan. I have ignored tennis betting for a long time. But when we get into conversations like this, I start to think of angles in my head. I start to think of ways, that I could find an edge. Now, obviously, if I'm asking these naive questions to you, Isaac, I'm probably way behind the curve, but it's going to get the motor going. It's going to start the gears churning in my head to think of, well, what else is there out there that could be a factor that is maybe not factored into line? So, Isaac, I love conversations like this. It makes me think of all these other things that I could think about between now and when I start to get comfortable betting tennis.
I
Now,
appreciate that.
I've got one more question here for you, Isaac, and it's in relation to those slower courts. Now, obviously, when you talk about fast versus slow, you're talking about how it's going to affect the pace of play, how fast they're moving. What does that mean for the lines? Like, if a court's trending slower, are you looking more at unders, stuff like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, yes, in general, the as we mentioned before, better serves are correlated with overs because less breaks means the sets will be longer. And so, if the courts are playing slower, that the most direct impact there is that serves are going to be less effective and players are going to win a lower percentage of their service games, which will mean that matches will be a bit shorter. So for the sort of total, it's probably going to be correlated with the under if the courts are slower. Another thing also is just, style of play. It's going to benefit players who, do better on a slower surface and which is most similar to clay. So if you imagine someone who's maybe a clay court specialist, they're probably going to do better on a slower hard court compared to a faster hard court. And just to add one more thing, which Jack might like, not only is there variation between the courts, there's variation in the balls, just like there is in baseball. And I know I'll give out a past edge for a previous tournament. I believe it was either earlier this year or last year at Indian Wells, which is one of the large tournaments right below the level of a major. They changed the balls and players were complaining a lot. And what happened was the balls were just getting very, very fluffy very quickly. And so they weren't bouncing as fast. And essentially the courts were playing like a clay court as opposed to like a hard court. And there were a lot of edges there. One in particular that did pretty well was betting. Some books offered bets on the total number of breaks. And so since that's sort of the thing that's most directly related, if you know that the courts are playing much slower and the balls are much slower, serves are going to be worse, which means that players are on average going to have a lot more breaks. And so, especially when we talk about the overlap between these sort of random things that might be changing, it's often easier to get an edge in derivative markets based on them, as opposed to the money line, where it's very tricky to tell, for example, whether or not things have been factored into the money line price. I mean, there's a big difference in the odds if the weather is 80 degrees versus 110 degrees, right? But unless you have a really well calibrated model, you don't know when you're looking at the money line whether or not that's going to be factored in. But especially at some of these props, it's usually not. And so if you can find an edge there, that's where you're going to be able to make the most money.
I
Fascinating.
mean, yeah, it's awesome seeing you break it down. Like these are the X equals Y equals Z. It's awesome. It's awesome watching that process come to the conclusion there.
No, and I gotta say, I was talking with a friend, and we were talking about what bets or what thing edges we wanted to give out, and my take is not enough people bet tennis, and the markets are not liquid, and so even if I'm maybe giving out an edge or two, or I'm saying something someone else can use to make some money, it's way better for me if there are a lot more people betting tennis, because my problem right now is that if you're betting a lot on these prop and derivative markets, you sort of stick out like a sore thumb. And obviously, the listeners of this podcast are pretty sharp, so maybe they're not the people who I want betting these things. But in general, especially for lower liquidity markets like this, I want more people betting them so that my action sticks out less.
Well, Isaac, thank you so much for being on. Thank you so much for sharing all of this ahead of the U.S. Open. We are very, very excited to be getting around to it and getting some betting going. And of course, if you want to check out Isaac's full betting tennis guide, you can do that on unabated.com. Use the link in the description of this video. We'll have that link there for you so you can check out even more from Isaac when it comes to betting on tennis before the U.S. Open gets started here. But where can people find you and the great work you're doing, Isaac?
Yes, you can find me on Twitter at roundrobin42. You can also find me on my website, howgamblingworks.com, where I'm writing about betting and the industry as well. A little bit quiet there. Will be more after the U.S. Open. Been focusing more on the betting side for now. And then, yeah, also I run a fantasy tennis website, tennispools.com. So if you're interested in that, totally non-monetized, just kind of a fun way to enjoy the tournament and have some fun with your friends or other people, check out tennispools.com.
All right, Isaac, thank you so much for being here with us as always. Looking forward to having you on again. Hoping that I can run into you this weekend up in New York before the U.S. Open. But for now, that is going to do it for us, ladies and gentlemen. Remember, ratings and reviews, please help us spread the show. And in the meantime, best of luck, everybody. And let's cash some tickets. We'll see you next week.